thanks for doing this. In terms of the areas I was interested to discuss, you and I work together. There's been a number of questions I've had in mind for a little while. One thing is I was interested to do a bit of a chronology. You were at Sevenoaks Art School, New York with CBGBs. You had these interesting left field influences in Brecht and Gramsci. You had a dynamic partner in Andy. It sounded like you guys very much ran the show. You've worked in creativity for several years in a variety of guises, at Story, at Vice, and many other things in between. At a certain point, we'll also start talking about wine, because that's one of the basis points. Your career, I can't think of anyone who's had a more varied career in terms of New York, Leeds, London, post-punk, advertising, Vice, and now you're in Bath. You obviously met Andy at Sevenoaks. Was there something in the air? Because obviously Paul Greengrass was there, Adam Curtis. Was there just something in the water?
I was fortunate enough to live in a village near Sevenoaks, which fell in the catchment area of the school. And it's one of the oldest schools in the world. I think it was founded in 1432. It's a very ancient school. It had a scheme funded by the local authority at that time called an assisted place. Essentially, it was a scholarship, but funded by the local authority, which I think actually conceptually is pretty disgraceful, really, to filter off a substantial amount of money for the kids who had done very well on the 11 plus, which is an IQ test. At the age of 11, we all got steered into a room and were asked to look at these pieces of paper with squares, triangles and circles and say what was the next symbol. I found it pretty easy to do. And did well enough to get a place at this school. So I then had this elite style education, 6 days a week. It was very interesting for me, coming from a working class family, to be among all this privilege and extraordinary facilities was an incredible fluke of luck. One of the great flukes was, and you mentioned Paul and Adam, was the art department had an incredibly high level of funding. It had its own photographic studios, film studios, kiln workshops, silk screens.
Wow.
It actually had a higher budget than Leeds University Fine Art Department. So it was extraordinarily well funded. I mean, when I would do oil paintings, all the oil paint and all the materials were free. I mean, the tube of oil paint is 10 quid or 20 quid. It was run by an inspirational teacher called Bob White, who was the father of one of my friends I made at Sevenoaks School, Mark, who became one of the singers of the Mekons. White is a very highly regarded artist, and he's very collected in Japan and had done very well at the Slade School, but was then running this department. And his department became the locus of our creative energies in the art department. It was done all the time. So you were in there doing your lessons, but in the background, there would be stuff. And when I was 11, I was exposed for the first time to music you never heard on the radio and probably still don't, like the Velvet Underground or well, not 11, it was, in my case, Bob Dylan, Highway 61 Revisited, came out, was on a lot. And that was a great shock to me. I just suddenly heard this stuff, which was not at all like anything you heard on pop radio. I was just so thrilled by it. I loved it. We were able to develop our own things under this tutelage of this very inspirational teacher who encouraged us all to do analytic thinking. I mean, in the context, you've got the fee-paying boys and then you've got these skinned-off clever boys. We were all super competitive with each other, which I think is quite common in that type of school. I also like to entertain each other. Similar-minded people were attracted to that. So with Andy Gill, Mark White, Kevin Lycett from the Mekons, Tom Greenhouse from the Mekons, me, Paul and Adam Curtis, among others, who were doing this stuff. So by the time we got to finish there, we'd all had very in-depth thinking about what we might want to do with our lives. I actually wanted to be an artist. I don't want to be a musician, though. But in my year off between school and university, I went to the States to stay with a friend who moved to Buffalo. His girlfriend's family had moved to Oklahoma City because they were in the oil business. And he went to Buffalo, which is 1,200 miles away from that, to be close to her. That's the idiocy of teenagers. And
Not close.
And I wanted to see the art galleries, the Albright Knox collection in Buffalo, which has got a lot of Marcel Duchamp things in. And then drove down to Washington, D.C., and then I hitchhiked up from DC to New York via Philadelphia, because the Arensberg collection was also, I think that's the best collection of Marcel Duchamp's things, which I was really obsessing about at the age of 18. I went to Leeds University with Kevin Lyset. Kevin and I both got to Sevenoaks School via the 11 plus. He and I went up together, and it was run by a great man, Sir Lawrence Gowing, who was the world's greatest authority on Vermeer and Cézanne, who I just adored, like unoriginally adored. He was also a very famous artist in his own right as part of the Camden Town group back in the 1940s. You know, very great man. Then in the second year, Andy Gill and Mark White and Tom Greenhouse came up. We were all part of this sort of group which hung out together, and we took over, or me and Kevin and Mark White and a guy called Andrew Corrigan, the other singer, took over the Film Society. So I saw 3, 4, 5 films a week, 2 of which we put on, and film became really interesting. That then sort of coincided with, I mean, Gil and I had a flat next to each other, with just sort of going out the whole time. I went out the whole time to gigs because I could get into for nothing to Leeds University's concerts. Leeds University at that time was an A-list venue for massive acts. The Refectory Hall, it's hard to imagine it now, the Refectory Hall with a capacity of about 900 is where Live at Leeds was recorded. Paul McCartney played there, Led Zeppelin played there. I saw Bob Marley play there, in a 900 capacity room. So when UK Tour played, this was an A-list venue. Led Zeppelin would have played to 50,000 people, but then they played to 900 people. That was a good gig. I saw all these bands and I thought that was fabulous. In my third year, I got a grant to write about Jasper Johns, the American pop artist, in New York. And because I thought I might write my dissertation about Jasper Johns, which I actually didn't. But a friend of a friend, actually Patrick Winter, who's now I think he's the politics correspondent of The Guardian, a friend of his was a woman called Mary Harron. Mary Harron lived in St. Mark's Place in New York, 8th Street. She said she could put me up. Gil asked if he could tag along. This is the summer of 1976. He had got a grant for much less money to do a photographic study of Gothic architecture in northern France. So he came to New York with me on the money. We landed on Mary's flat. She had a studio flat. It was tiny, down in CD Village. You probably now know New York from the meatpacking district from So Shishi, and basically everywhere south of Houston Street was grim in those days, you know. And then you get to that city, and it was Mugger Central. Mary was then a journalist for New York Punk magazine, which is some legendary now. He used to run photojournalist stories where people have love affairs and they put little speech bubbles. There was one with Joey Ramone and Debbie Harry falling in love. Mary was a journalist there, and she'd just broken up with the drummer, I think J.D. Doherty, who was then the drummer of an unknown band called the Patti Smith Group. They were
on their way up.
On their way up. And so she was there. And of course, later, Mary became the director of the infamous Betty Page and American Psycho later on.
Yeah, brilliant movie.
So Mary did that later on. But she was a journalist when we met her. Because she'd broken up with her boyfriend, she didn't mind having these two scruffy English people arriving with her. And we got in, we were about 4 blocks away from CBGBs. So I went to CBGBs every night, again, for nothing. It was very small. I think it must have had a capacity of maybe 100.
Oh my gosh, it's like a shoebox.
Yeah, I think it was
sweaty shoebox.
It's a long thing with this stage that's about a foot off the ground. And then you'd go in there and there's a pinball machine. I played pinball with Joey Ramone, for example, because Ramones were sort of on their way up. It seemed like everyone in the room was in a band, and I think most of them were. We'd sit out drinking with Richard Hell and the Voidoids, or the Dead Boys, who had a sort of residency there. I hadn't seen that sort of thing before, particularly like Richard Hell or Television, who were a big band then.
Wow, yeah, love
Television. And they were great. And I mean, they were phenomenal musicians. I think they're probably the best musicians I've seen in a band. It was quite technical. I think now they'd probably be in like the Dave Matthews Band, because it's all noodling. But it was
Richard Hell for me.
no, it wasn't technically accomplished enough. But Richard Hell looked fantastic. He sort of invented, or made a big part in inventing the punk rock look, the torn jackets and all that kind of stuff. He looked really cool and sang in that bored way, which was very interesting. So, hung out there a lot and then came back to England.
How long were you in New York for?
6 weeks.
Wow. Okay. So you had like a hothouse education in terms of what was going nuts in New York at the time.
Yeah, because I revered the Velvet Underground. And going back to Sevenoaks School, one of my friends' father used to do the film program on BBC TV, and he was a journalist with the Sunday Times. He had been sent a review copy of the Velvet Underground and Nico, which he thought was rubbish. And I just kind of don't blame him.
An indication that it might be different to what's gone before.
And it was the one with the peel-off banana on the outside. So, but when I heard
the Andy Warhol designed cover.
Yeah, but when I heard that for the first time, I was like, I think every single other musician, thinking, wow, I didn't know that this was possible to make music that sounded like this. So going to New York, I thought, before I arrived there, that really where I wanted to go was Max's Kansas City, which is where the Velvet Underground recorded live at Max's Kansas City, which is one of my favorite live albums. But in fact, that was a bit of a dump by then, and it's certainly not. It was sort of second division venue compared to CBGBs. Really horrible.
Can you just contextualize what? So obviously we've come across CBGBs and know that it's got this kind of legendary status, but just describe a little bit of its status and the journey of rock and roll.
Well, I think there are some places where musicians cluster. In London, it would have been the 100 Club, for example, for punk rock. Ronnie Scott's was a big place, not just for jazz, but also for people like Hendrix would go down there. When I was 16, 17, we used to, on a Saturday night, drive up to London to go to Ronnie Scott's. And whatever was on, was on. I think it was, there are some places where there's an incredible concentration of stuff. The clustering is the thing. You need clustering, especially if you're all a bit broke. One is you've got a built-in audience from everybody who's a bit like you, and you can borrow and lend each other equipment and facilities. What else is doing? And you can play the guitar. We had a friend of ours, Hugo, became the drummer. He had a drum kit. He was a drummer, and he used to put on events at Cranbrook School in Kent when he was at school, which is a kind of similar school. They put Genesis on at Cranbrook School. Just again, putting into context how utterly different things were then, in the sense of people going along to live gigs. People didn't really, going to live gigs wasn't a thing. There were no festivals at all. It wasn't part of the entertainment spend. People would go to the cinema. Gigs wasn't a big.
I guess the term underground was invented for that kind of group of people who are all passionate about a single thing.
I remember seeing Hawkwind at Tunbridge Town Hall. Lemmy off his face on acid and speed, but in a 500 capacity hall playing In Search of Space. I think what we started doing was really more of a gag at the beginning. We wrote songs that were like songs we'd heard, and we were most like feel good. I'd seen them, I don't know, half a dozen times, and he exactly copied the guitar style of Wilco and the way he was on stage.
How would you describe Dr. Feelgood? Kind of pub rock?
They all came from Canvey Island, along with another band, the Kersal Flyers. and who had one of the songs that were the most inventive titles. Little does she know that I know that she knows she's two-timing me, I think it was. But the Feel Goods played really straight ahead, what used to be called R&B. That R&B now has sort of migrated to African-American dance music, but R&B then used to be really sort of like brutally stripped back type sound. And it was very much in a completely different musical vocabulary to bands like Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Yes and America and all these kind of bombastic AOR type things.
Well known for your anti-solos, anti-guitar solos, anti-love songs, kind of purity. Why did you, who were the bad guys? Was it these prog rock, lazy crap, or I don't want to put words in your mouth. Were you rebelling against the convention? Were you trying to challenge something? I know that you guys were quite influenced by politics and stuff. Where did that kind of anti-vibe come from?
We were motivated by being anti as opposed to wanting to do something different. The music that I was thrilled by as a teenager, among who you mentioned, Velvet Underground, and the like, there's Jimi Hendrix, of course, who was a fantastic player, and American Electric Blues. So Muddy Waters was a great
Chicago
hero. Like I think a lot of British bands, you start off sort of trying to play blues music like Led Zeppelin did.
Yeah, Rolling Stones,
or
hugely influenced by blues.
Exactly. So in that trajectory, you end up somewhere. Bands that I loved Led Zeppelin. If you listen to a Led Zeppelin record now, there's not much going on in a Led Zeppelin album, or AC/DC, you think it's really, really simple and brilliant. I didn't like all that nonsense. Songs, I admire the song by someone like Sparks, but This Town Ain't Big Enough for Both of Us. You sit there thinking, blimey, that must have taken a month to make. With everything going on, then you discover other interesting things going on, like bands like Can and Krautrock, which used to Eamon Dool and all those kind of things. You thought, well, you want to be heavy, and of course reggae music. So the most played record, I think one of the most played, was the Trojan Story, the box set of all those amazing ska and reggae things. Going to Leeds was great because I had been in a place that was completely white. I mean, this town had no ethnic minority representation whatsoever, which had a fantastic Afro-Caribbean community who we instantly sort of thought, this is the place to be. You bond with the people there, and went to blues dances and things like that. The non-licensed drinking dance venues, and dancing was a big thing. So I think it was just trying to do something interesting with guitar in it that we could do. I mean, it's sort of within your own constraints. After a while, when you write songs which are dominant, subdominant, tonic type constructions, 2-5-1 songs. Obviously, 2-5-1 is the way all pop music goes, as recently proven on Ed Sheeran's court case. You can play 2-5-1, you can sing anything over the top of that. But if you start thinking, what is it that you're trying to do? And why I don't want to do something that's just sort of like something else. And then if you try and do something that's different, you have to sort of set up a vocabulary and rules for it. And again, you and I have in the past talked about these things. You end up with a type of a grammatical approach to being creative, which is to say the rules are X, Y, and Z. You can set them for yourself. For example, you might put up, obviously, I didn't write in iambic pentameters, but as a rule, poets in the past would say, okay, we can have 8 syllables per line or whatever. So if you sort of decide what rules they are to yourself, then that makes it quite a lot easier. It's like having a really good brief in advertising. Do this, and I'm not going to do that. Or to try and write a song which has got no words in more than 2 syllables in it.
So you're like creating a whole new rule book
for what we were doing. I wrote the words and co-wrote the music, and so you'd start thinking, how's it all going to hang together? And of course, then when you've got a really great drummer and a really great bass player and a guitarist and a singer on it, then try and make them all work within these rules. Some of the songs have, I talk about 2-5-1 or chord progressions, some have no core progressions at all. They just, I mean, what we all want is a riff, and it never changes. So that's like, or inspired by Can. It goes on and it goes on, and then you sort of meander around with it.
Do you think that was informed by your kind of, because obviously there's loads of musicians, brilliant musicians and creatives who came out of art school and kind of looked at things afresh. How much do you think that art school background informed your mindset?
I think completely. One of the great tragedies of the governance of Britain has been the abandonment of support of creativity. The awful things about it is the fact that the creative sector is worth 114 billion pounds a year to the UK, second only to finance. And there was not 1 second spent in any discussion with the European Union about people working in the creative sector. And I mean dancers, fashion designers, musicians, composers. So part of that abandonment of creativity, which we saw recently in those negotiations, was the idea that creativity or the creative areas are somehow a waste of money for young people. Actually, people with arts degrees are much more employable than people with generally career-based degrees. Only recently, the government said the compulsory subjects, are going to be maths and science. Actually, we make our money from producing 40% of the world's software for games. The games industry massively dominates the world with TV and movie programming.
TV, storytelling, acting, music.
All of those things. College was a place where you could actually do very little. It wasn't like doing a hard subject. It was a hard subject, but you didn't have to necessarily approach it like that. And I remember when we were there at the Polytechnic, there was friends of ours, Green Gartside from Scritti Politti, Frank Toby from Cadgadbit, and Mark Armand. We always sit in a little room in the pub, the Fenton pub in Leeds, which was about the same size as this. It's about 4 meters by 5 meters square room. So you'd have Gang of Four, Scritti Politti, Mark Armand, Fad Gadget, Delta 5, all sitting around in this little room. The art college thing allowed that to happen. I used to joke with Green, say, you think concept art means you can lie in bed till 3 in the afternoon. And
more creative time.
Yeah, it was great time. The art college thing was so important since I was studying fine arts. The polytechnics then became universities, and people had to write about stuff. Well, a lot of my artistic friends are not very good at writing things, and then they're very good at arranging things, designing things, or coming up with things, but maybe try to ask for a coherent description of, for example, the posters behind you could be a struggle in words.
It's interesting. My dad's he was at Slade and St Martin's, since became a photographer, sculptor. Many times I'd ask him for his take on his own work, and he'd refuse to talk it through because obviously the work speaks for itself.
Yeah.
What you're describing is you're trying to expunge the fun from something by forcing you to rationalize it.
Yeah. I when my daughter was doing her art A-level, I took her and a friend to the National Gallery, and one of the things I was talking about actually in the Impressionist paintings and talking about painting modernity. So in her course, Impressionism was all about color and the understanding of light. That's why they were talking about it, and it needed to be written about like that. And I said, well, actually, it's about painting modernity, going to the seaside because there were now trains, painting a train because there had never been a train before. The houseization of Paris, all of those kind of things. But so the sort of lateral thinking is now impermissible, or it's not encouraged. Again, having had, in my case and in your case, a privileged education by a fluke, increasingly now musicians and actors are drawn from those kind of schools because those are the schools who've got the surplus value to allow you to do drama classes or even sport. I mean, cricket. How many schools have 6 cricket pitches? I mean, it's a thing that suppresses creativity, and that's what makes Britain great. Britain is great because it is creative. It absorbs and comes up with something new, like grime coming out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I mean, amazing. You get artists like Stormzy come along. You think, how did that happen? How did someone as brilliant as that just sort of pop up? How is it that Ed Sheeran has become the greatest act in the world of that type of music? Incredible. A lot of it is from not having a great hammer over your head of saying everything you do must be designed to make money. Because not everything you do is actually, when you want to change the world, sometimes you don't make money out of changing the world.
That's a revolutionary thought in itself. You were doing the writing and contributing to the music. Can you describe a bit, because Andy Gill's put it on record on a few different occasions that you and he kind of drove things and set the tone. What was that process working between you and really talented, great band?
Well, I don't think there was one specific process, but an amazing setup in Leeds in Wolf Street. The local Whole Food collective had a warehouse they didn't really use, and they said we could use it as a rehearsal space. So we set up our equipment in there, which the Nikons and Delta 5 and whoever could use when we weren't in there. So typically we turn up there and try to either have a groove, which might come from the drummer Hugo, the bass player Dave Allen, might come up with a groove, and then we would improvise over the top of it, or we might have come up with a riff. It could have been a vocal riff or a guitar riff, and then present it, but it would happen in the room. The one thing we didn't want to do was to improvise in the way that led you down into the dark alley of jazz funk and things like that. Quite often, it's very easy to play blues music and rock and roll tracks because it's verse, bridge, chorus, key change, verse, bridge, chorus out. Obviously, anyone who loves music will have listened to Robert Johnson. I don't know how many tracks he recorded, like 20 or something back in 1928. But they are the text of all rock and roll music ever since. They're continuously surprising. One of the surprising things, what these songs mean, and you meet the devil at the crossroads and you cut a deal, which gives you this incredible mojo and incredibly powerful narratives. He died ideally, as everyone wants to die, in a bar fight, murdered by some jealous husband.
Yeah. I'm interested by your creative process because we collaborated creatively over time, different briefs, different bits of work when we were at the same advertising agency. Obviously, we saw the documentary with Jackson on the Beatles recording Let It Be in Twickenham. Did you have a chance to watch that? Did any of that resonate? Did you see some of the simmering tensions and the energy in the room? Or was it quite different with you guys?
Well, actually, I physically, when I was at school, I physically ran into the Beatles at school and fell over as we were running into George Harrison and John Lennon and Paul McCartney in Sevenoaks. Me and my friend were scampering down to have our lunch, which was some construction work, which meant that they were giving meals to the local cinema. And we ran into the most famous people in the world in Sevenoaks High Street. Looked up, there they were. We then sort of thought, Beatles lunch, ran off for our lunch, because otherwise you wouldn't get But they had just left the Sevenoaks antique shop where John Lennon had bought a flyer for a Victorian entertainment. For the benefit of Mr. Kite, there will be a show tonight on Trampoline. He just bought that in Sevenoaks. That day, they were filming Magical Mystery Tour in Knoll Park. Wow. So the Beatles stuff was very interesting. Watching Get Back, Hugo, my drummer's father, is in Get Back. He was in the rag trade just around the corner from the office. So he's actually in the film. Hugo's dad was
is he one of the Vox Pops or is he in the studio?
He's a Vox Pops. He's down in the road. He's not like those funny men with bowler hats. But no, that process, in the end, they end up.
Well, it's the director, isn't it?
What this leech, lame, silly ideas designed just to sort of, I don't know, someone of such little accomplishment compared to the boys. But you had Hugo sitting there who obviously had nothing to do until it was done, because he didn't have any involvement in it. There was George who was being sidelined, which is a classic thing. And then there's the singer and the guitar. Well, they're all singers. Bass player and the guitarist. And there's Paul knocking it out. And that was the writing of, was it Get Back? Was it classic? That's exactly how we worked. So you start writing phonetically. Yeah. And if you can get into it, you get something going on, and then you might think about a tune.
I quite like the way that they would ask you. So, as you said, Paul would turn up with an idea, with a melody, or George would, and they'd start like George would be kind of groping for a lyric. And, John would be like, just think of something completely unrelated to it and just shove it in and see if it works.
I know the legendary story about Yesterday is the original lyric was scrambled eggs. It was da 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 da. That's all I want is scrambled eggs, and that's a normal thing to do. But what a lot of people did, and I was of that school, was write down all the time lines that came to my mind. Still do it all the time in my phone. If I think of something, I put it down as a line, becomes the thing. So like at home he's a tourist was a line that came to me. I suppose conceptually it's a straightforward existential lift, that you feel sometimes stranger in the familiarity of things, and it's all a spectacle and all a show. But as soon as you've done that, you think, oh, that's interesting. It almost writes itself after that point.
So in that instance, was the music first, or was the lyric and the idea first? Because I think what you're pointing to is
the lyric had or that line and a couple of lyrics were already on a bit of paper somewhere or other, and then we were joking we ought to write a disco song, and so Dave, Alan, and Hugo started which was this groove, which was just going to go on and on and on, and then Andy did his sort of extravagant noise over the top, freewheeling, and I was going da 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 da, like that. So that one was very much worked out in the room, but the lyrics already existed. Having then spoken phonetically over the top of it, which is a normal thing, then you go, oh, okay, that's what the idea is. But often you don't know what the idea is until after you've done it. Or one of these songs, I remember Andy and I'd been playing pool in America. We used to play pool all the time. We played pool in Barney's Beanery in Los Angeles, a well-known sort of dump in West Hollywood where people used to hang out. We were playing with these two redneck American truck drivers for money because so we basically just paid to stay on the table. We were playing, and these guys weren't playing very well, I think, because they obviously got really stuck into the beers. But they would say things like, I moved from one place to the next, and I hope they keep down the price of gas, all this stuff. And I remember next day, I wrote all this down because it was still fresh in my mind. There's a song called Cheeseburger on the second album. A lot of the lyrics are just my memory of what these blokes said. I won't let my daughter go with a red. See how I run. They do this thing, high numbers, low numbers, 8-ball break. And I thought, that's a really good chorus. So
I'll let you win now.
That was quite interesting. Having mentioned my encounter with greatness running into the Beatles, of course, it does take a great imagination to turn a flyer for Victorian Entertainment, which says, for the benefit of Mr. Kite, there will be a show tonight on trampoline. I'm not sure how exactly it follows the poster, but I think it's pretty close to it all. The Hendersons will all be there, later Pablo Frank's there, and then the scene. The great Beatles song is Day in the Life.
That's my favourite.
John had seen a story about a bloke who ended up, who was quite well known, had gone through the windscreen of his car and had a photograph of the wreck. That was interesting because you had that bit, the reportage thing, and then Paul had written a completely different song, which was the woke up, got out of bed, and George Martin somehow got them to work at the end of it, telling the orchestra, everyone to go up their instruments in their own time in the scale of C to make a like end of the world noise. Meandering about the creative process. That is, when you have a thing, you want to do is find out what the thing is that it might be and what it's not. What are people interested in? Like in wine, there are different occasions at which these things are consumed. Each occasion has its own motivations and rules about it. When it is the right time to drink champagne, Larry Hagman would have said any time of day. There are rules about it. There are festive rules. Understanding those rules, then you can understand what it is you're trying to say about the rules of experience.
I remember we worked on a piece for Jack Daniel's whiskey, which was being sold in different airports across the world. The insight that we came across was, people turn up to duty free, get through customs, and suddenly they're transformed into something different, and the normal rules don't apply.
Yeah,
that is exact kind of beautiful constraint that allows you to be creative. If it could be anything, it's probably going to be nothing. But if it's something, then you've got something to work with. As you said, you can subvert it, you can switch it round, you can put it in different context.
Yeah. So that's, once people recognize a deep truth in something, then it can carry forward. It might be a universal emotional truth, like Adele, for example, talked about the pain of breakups very wonderfully. She writes these things. Or it might be Lou Reed talking about being a junkie. I mean, I over the last couple of years, unfortunately, several people I knew have died, but one of them was the great Mark Lanigan. Concert in Poland as a guest singer. I mean, he and I both were asked by John Cale to sing some Nico songs. In my case, in German, I sang 3 songs in the opera house for this tribute to Nico. Mark and I were talking backstage about Delta blues, Robert pre-Chicago blues.
The original.
And I was saying to him, and we were talking about the unimprovable song titles of all time. Some of those Delta blues songs, like Fattening Frogs for Snakes, for example. Great. I mean, how could anyone write that? It's a great song. I said one of the most brilliant songs, I think it was by Blind Lemon Jefferson, was Please Tend My Grave When I Am Gone. And Mark said, oh man, and he had it tattooed across his back.
Can we just contextualize who, just in case people aren't
from Queens of the Stone Age and all that stuff, yeah.
How did you meet?
We were on the same bill as Queens of the Stone Age somewhere else. They're all great blokes. I like what they do, and they like what we did. There's a lot of camaraderie in music. You don't often bump into people except at the award ceremonies and maybe on a festival bill. It's nice to find people you really like. You don't have to show off.
The things that, obviously we've known each other for a few years now. Obviously, we talked about the influence in terms of mindset and ways of thinking that art school clearly had on your career and your thought process. But how much do you, obviously Entertainment is one of the great albums of the last 50 years, supposedly post-punk, that obviously has lots of influences, are continuous. Is that a part of a punk sensibility? Because in lots of ways, you're very well-spoken, civilized, educated, thoughtful, but moving from the purity of the work you did with Gang of Four and then acting as a hidden persuader in the advertising industry, I was always fascinated by the swervy route that you took in your career.
I think what is interesting about the world is trying to decode what's going on. And it's sometimes quite mysterious. And to try and come up with something that's really summarizes everything in a line is a great characteristic of the communication industries. Someone like Karl Marx, who would have been great in advertising.
Sadly missed career.
It come up with lines like history, first time tragedy, second time farce. You think it's pretty genius. Workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. Of the Paris 68 era. What was most interesting is the Atelier Paris people who made those very interesting posters, which were all knocked out on silk screens at incredibly low cost. And it would say something like, demand the impossible, which would be great, underneath every pavement is sand, That sort of thing often is a great pleasure. The idea of getting something everybody is familiar with and then twisting it. The French call it détournement. I did on the cover of Entertainment, which is very
iconic artwork.
The homage to Situationist. So the cowboy and the Indian shaking hands. I drew that picture from one of the most famous, the biggest selling German author of all time, who wrote the Winnetou series and sold hundreds of millions of copies. It's a really famous image, and it was a really big pan-European TV series. And you had the Native American shaking hands with this cowboy. And of course, the image was always a bit like the Lone Ranger and Tonto, the idea that you could have this sort of relationship between the white guy and the Native American.
Which implicitly reinforces conventional thinking and conventional arrangements.
Yeah, but you put on it, they think they're friends. Now he's fooled. You've changed the narrative, but it's exactly the same thing. And so that whole thing is very interesting. And of course, you can apply that to all parts.
Do you feel that you were doing that to the music that the rest of the band was doing, or do you feel that you were doing that along with the band in relation to the music that had gone before?
I think if you really like music, you're going to see lots of this stuff. I have great sympathy with a lot of people who are really, really good at music. I'm not really good at playing. I can play the piano badly. Paul McCartney plays the piano really badly, but he does it really brilliantly. The Long and Winding Road is a fantastic. The chord progression is really, 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 really interesting, and it's slightly not what you'd come up with if you had really studied music. I don't think you'd have come up with that. You wouldn't have done that. I think if you know everything, sometimes you end up knowing nothing. You know everything, but you can do nothing because everything is going to be inevitable. Think of the recent Ed Sheeran case. What Ed Sheeran was saying was, you can't pick up on the chord progression of Let's Get It On when that could underlie probably 400 songs. I mean, you could probably do a medley at 4, maybe even more, hundreds and hundreds of songs. Use that thing because that's just like air. But it's not. I think the thing that sometimes seems to have happened is that the subject matters of songs is narrowed. This is of super similarities, which is not to knock pop music and stuff, but you think of folk music or traditional music, which are all about hangings and murder and slaughters and, you know, Danny Boy having to leave the starvation of Ireland, and this woman saying, well, you may come back and I could be dead, but walk on my grave. And that's a sentimental standard throughout the world to sing that, but it's a really dark subject, isn't it?
Homecoming song.
Yeah, you know, and
I think the point you were talking about with McCartney and Lennon, there was a recent documentary with Quincy Jones where you could see Quincy was kind of poking McCartney a little bit, and McCartney was visibly quite uncomfortable. Quincy at various points basically said the Beatles were crap as musicians. It kind of makes an interesting question that to be a great artist, you need to be a great technician. There's one route where you need to be the master of the rules before you could subvert them. But maybe the art school sensibility says, just be aware of the rules and then throw them out the window. Do you think any of that kind of resonates?
I think you don't have to be a master to do, you have to know what you're the master of. I mean, Cézanne, was the most recent blockbuster exhibition of his, he used to hate Ingres. And Ingres is all about polish. You couldn't see the brush marks at all on an Ingres painting. The painting of Madame Lamoitessier, I think Ingres spent decades finishing it off. Cézanne sometimes didn't finish things off. But could he have painted like Ingres? No, he couldn't have done. He was technically incapable of doing that. Ingres could never, ever have done what Cézanne did.
I think this is it. One might be a better painter. The other one's clearly an artist.
And if you think, who changed the conversation the most? Cézanne, ability to paint fabric and skin so perfectly that it almost is fabric and skin. I like it, but I mean, it's not going to move the conversation. Was Robert Johnson the greatest guitarist in the world? No, he wasn't really. But was what he did among the most important music made in the last 150 years? Yes.
I've read a quote of Dylan talking about McCartney saying that he's the only one that I really keep an eye on because of his talent for melody.
Yeah.
You could be a great guitarist, but if you're not able to weave it into something which moves people, then it's maybe a bit dead.
I've got only 10 more minutes.
One of your lyrics is about get drunk on cheap wine. What's your journey, your adventure with wine been? How did you get into it? Have there been any important or interesting bottles stuck in your mind?
Well, when I was a teenager, I was the first person in my family to have a passport. I had the incredible good fortune of the same bloke, Toby Oakes, whose father was this journalist for the Sunday Times, had got a gig for the Sunday Times to travel down through France and staying at rather amazing hotels and things, and then end up in the Doyen at some other writer's place. My first taste of wine was at 16 in France in a fantastic restaurant. It was like drinking nectar. I was just I'd never drunk wine before. My parents didn't drink at all, so there's no alcohol of any kind in the house. So it was really, along with the great food, like a curtain opening up, and there were possibilities. The possibilities are that in every part of your life, you can find something that makes you feel, I'm not talking about the alcohol side, is rewarding and great. And then you can identify moments by tastes and smells. I didn't have any money, really, so we drank beer, especially in Leeds, a very beery place. The only wine that was generally drunk there was sherry made in Leeds, which was only palatable if mixed with lemonade or something like that. Some people mix sherry and cider to get the increased alcohol component. Going on tour, you had the choice to start choosing stuff. And we were at first quite a sort of heavy drinking crew of beer and spirits. But that is very bloaty and difficult to sustain if you're working really, really hard. And we used to play 2 shows a night on at 11, one in the morning. So I think we did something like 45 shows in 30 days. If you surrender to that, you can get really fat, ill and rough. So we said, we can't have all of this going on. We got it more selective. And you know about the rider business with bands. So we started thinking about what we were drinking. In the end, our wine on our rider was Puligny Montrachet.
Was it any particular producer?
I think like 2003 and 4. The thing about riders is there's a monetary value. The promoter might say the cost of providing the band with food and snacks and drink and all that stuff is $500.
Yeah.
It could be spent on, 3 bottles of Jack Daniels, a load of beers and all this kind of stuff. Or you could say, don't want any of that stuff, which is what we said. We'd rather have 6 bottles of a really nice wine and only Japanese or import beer. So no spirits. Don't want any spirits whatsoever. In the end, we said, just give us the money and we'll bring our own. So we would buy Italian red wines for touring with, and we used to drink a lot of Montepulciano d'Abruzzo on tour, which is a very good tour drink. A lot of musicians like a bit of, who are singers, I don't like it because port and lemon is quite a classic drink for wetting your whistle. So generally there would be this kind of thing where we'd try and think of something that was really rewarding, but you can't get hammered. You actually taste it. And McGill had my sadly dead songwriting partner. He was a great enophile. And sometimes I would get exasperated at how long it would take to order wine in meals.
With the wine list?
Yeah, when the record company are paying for it, you always choose the one that's 1 bottle less expensive than the most expensive.
Yeah. What wines was he gravitating towards? Was he a Bordeaux man, Burgundy man?
Burgundy, yeah. And they would drink a lot. Pinot Noir was quite well consumed. One time, though, it almost disrupted our rehearsal. We were in Sicily and we'd arrived quite early. The promoter had a relationship with the local vineyard, which produced a range of wines called Planeta.
Yeah.
We went there and had lunch with the owner of the vineyard and given a tour of it. And the Planeta Chardonnay was some of the most amazing. It was incredible. We went back and then we said, we've got to go back and buy a case to take with us. That was a bit difficult because it couldn't really be freighted in an airplane. You have something and you think this is the work of art. I think some of these things are works of art. Some of those Oregon-based reds from America. One of my best friends in Berkeley in the US was one of the founders of Chez Panisse in Berkeley. And that used to have terrific, incredible wine lists. I know people get very poncy about wine and all that stuff, but I don't see what's wrong with being poncy about it. I despair these days when I go out and I'm being offered Prosecco, which I will never drink. On the other hand, it's a lifelong relationship with Spain, so I'm quite happy to drink Cava.
Yeah.
But it's fun, but it's not a big deal. But of course, a delicious Chardonnay from a great producer in Burgundy is really gonna do the nuts.
What's on your rider? So obviously you're heading over to California to do a range of shows. What's on your rider at the moment, or are you sourcing your own?
we're sorting our own. We just ask for them, say, give us the money. At the beginning, Hugo and me will go to one of the big wine stores in San Diego, and we'll walk around with a trolley and buy stuff for the next 3 shows. There's 10 of us in the entourage. I only now have 1, possibly occasionally 2 glasses before we go on, but normally just 1 glass and then drink after the show. So red wine, Italian red wine is what we drink. Hugo's a big fan of that. And so I think that's bound to be on the list. And then a real Chardonnay. I'm not a fan of Sauvignon Blancs, particularly.
When you're in there, let me know and we'll check out the list and offer you some recommendations.
Oh, definitely. That's it. No, I mean, I think what you do is very good, being helpful like that. I mean, just sort of say, what is the purpose of this drinking opportunity? You know, being all marketing wise, but that sometimes you like having a good house wine, I find is really helpful. My house white wine is a Picpoul de Pinot. It's nice and light. You get a decent one, it's a nice little thing, isn't it?
John's Tuesday night wine. How did you get on with the Pack Syrah? I think you had that a little while ago that we shared with you.
It was delicious. It was very that's what I like about the series, the sort of spiciness of them. They've got a really nice edge. I've got a couple of bottles of different Syrahs. I like that flavour of wine. Where does all that pepperiness come from? Grapes are not peppery. How does that happen? It's the most incredible process. One of my mates has a small vineyard in Northern California. The work he puts in to get these grapes out, the wine that he produces, a fine wine stuff, but it's so hard to do. It's so hard to make something. It is like magic, and it is creative, and it's a wonderful thing,
And the opportunity to share it with people makes it.
That's why France is such a great country. They've got massive wine production, and it affects everything. Driving through France, the best country in the world to drive in, you see a load of trucks at the Les Routiers stop, and you pull over there, and all the truck drivers are having a little glass, which is probably not the safest in the world. But they're working class men who said this is an important thing for quality of life. Yeah. It's not an optional kind of thing. I'd rather have a culture built on having Les Routiers stops than drinking Coors or Rolling Rock beer.
Awesome. Thank you so much for this. Really pleased that you wanted to spend a bit of time talking about your journey. Look forward to the next chat.
All right. Thanks a lot, mate.
Thanks, John.
See ya. Bye.